Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Mike Brock. Now, many of you who follow Mike on Twitter and social media will know him as the CEO of TBD, which focuses on decentralized applications, Web5, and is within the block ecosystem. Awesome company that he's been at for a very long time. But Mike also offers a lot of perspective to the Bitcoin community, talking a lot about things in the world, about politics, philosophy, and I think it's just really one of the greatest follows in the space to get a lot of nuanced views on certain big high world impacts. So we get into all of that. We talk about philosophy, social media, political polarization, the Bitcoin ecosystem, Bitcoin culture. And this was just a really fun conversation for me. And I'm sure a lot of people will have, different views or disagreements or agreements with this episode, but we'll continue to put out more content like this, in addition to all sorts of content through the Progressive Bitcoiner that just covers nuanced conversations, and just had a really good time chatting with Mike, and we'll definitely be sure to do this again in the future. So again, if you have any feedback on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com, and we'll see you again next week. Hey, Mike, welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, Trey. Glad to be here.
Yeah, as I was just saying to you before we hit record, one of the reasons I'm really interested to have you on the show is, once I got into Bitcoin a few years ago, I've kind of seen you being a steady presence online in the community, being around for a while, talking about things and, for lack of better terms, trying to, what I view as, be a voice of reason on a lot of very complex and nuanced things. Which I guess sounds a little wild to say, but in this day of extreme polarization on social media and all different avenues, I think that's a real strength. So I've really enjoyed seeing you kind of in the space on Twitter, on whatever the case may be, talking about a lot of complex things and being real signal on that. But before we jump into all of this and this really good conversation, can you let folks know who you are, your background, things like that for folks that may not know you?
Yeah. I'm the CEO of TBD, which is a part of the broader company block, formerly known as Square. Before I was leading this new division of the company, which hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about today, what we're doing and how I think it's relevant to the things you speak about. I was leading our strategy team at Cash App. I was one of the early team members there that built a lot of the early infrastructure and products for Cash App. Before that, I was an engineer at Red Hat, doing open source stuff and I'm kind of back to open source stuff, TBD. So that's kind of my brief sort of curriculum vitae. I'm kind of, one of the things you sort of mentioned is like sort of seeing me in the community, like talking about like all various different things, like political things, philosophical things, moral things. It's funny. I don't know if I've ever said this in any interview before, but like, one of my sort of initial passions in life was philosophy, actually. And so in some ways, I sometimes jokingly refer to myself as a failed philosopher. I didn't really follow that as an academic path. And funnily enough, like a lot of my good friends are actual real philosophers who operate inside philosophy departments in universities. So I'm always loving thinking about the world in really deep places and morally parsing things. And so that's kind of like, I think that's probably the other side of me, and the one that you're probably seeing a little bit come through on Twitter or x.com now. Mm-hmm. That's my kind of been my outlet for that. And most of that all being my personal opinions, and not, I've tried to actually use to be clear, like my public persona on Twitter /x.com as sort of my personal non-professional outlet. Sometimes hard to like separate those things, but yeah, that's me.
Same for us all. You mentioned some of the philosophers too, and many of them, especially in the Bitcoin space, like like Bradley, Troy, Andrew, just awesome voices that have become more vocal in the past year or two, which pulled people like me in, like us humanities kids, because I have a background in sociology, and that's kind of my heart and passion. And I think too, I don't know if you would consider yourself a cypherpunk a bit, but I think the cypherpunks are deeply philosophical, right? Just the movement, and then you see people who still either label themselves that or involved in that work today, deeply philosophical group. And I think that's a huge draw and passion for a lot of the cypherpunks is not, yes, it's technology, code, it's not money, that's for sure. But it's this deeper sense of like trying to fix broken things, I think. And I see that a lot in what you're posting at least, and the work at TBD as well, which we'll get into. So that completely makes sense to me.
Cool. I don't know. I would call myself a cypherpunk. It's probably not fair to say that. Although I certainly admire a lot of the values that cypherpunks have sort of brought to the internet over the years. And we can talk about that. And I mean, I view that as a really important part of civil society and the sort of the counterbalancing of power structures. So, like, love the cypherpunk community. I wouldn't portray myself as part of it. But yeah, no, yay cypherpunks.
Yeah. End episode. Well, one of the things I want to start off too, because I think, I think it'll be similar in some ways, but a bit different as well. But your conversation with Peter McCormack, maybe a year ago, it's probably less than that at this point. But one of the things that was interesting that you started off with that is really kind of funny and ironic to me. There's some Bitcoiners that would say, that have literally said to me, right? And I'm not saying all, but many have said, oh, if you're progressive or left coming into Bitcoin, you'll lose that over time. You'll become less progressive or less left or whatever as you grow into Bitcoin. And I think there's a lot of pushback arguments there, and we can go into why Bitcoin is apolitical in this political party and identity sense, and it's code and tech. It is political in one way. But what's funny is
we should talk about that. I'm not sure that Bitcoin is apolitical, but I don't think it's political in the way that I think you and I will agree it's not political in the way that like precludes, say, bringing it to a progressive politics or bringing it to a liberal politics, or like, I mean, it's certainly political in the sense that, like you can't disentangle technology and culture from politics. And so, the failed political philosopher in me would push back a little bit on the use of the term apolitical. But I think like the point that you were making, and the one that I would certainly make, is that, you don't have to be a right-wing libertarian or an anarchist or, anarcho-capitalist in order to see Bitcoin as part of a broader set of tools in the world to bring about like positive change. Either in the narrow economic sense or in a broader cultural sense or even a political sense. So I would quibble with the term apolitical. I've never said that about it, but I definitely agree with the sentiment that you advance when you make that point.
Yeah, and I think there's so much in Bitcoin that people have a tough time putting labels to, right? Mm-hmm. Just in general, like this podcast is called The Progressive Bitcoiner, and I have gone back and forth with that so many times, and I've personally come to a place where I'd like to try to revisit that word in a new era that Bitcoin is ushering in. And it's a bit of marketing as well, if I'm being honest, to say, if you're a progressive and left, you have been told, mainstream and a lot of politicians, that Bitcoin is not for you, that you shouldn't be into Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin is your enemy in one way or another. And it's a part of this right-wing camp in the United States, right? So I try to have a lot of global conversations on this podcast as well, so people can see this is a lot of times just a Western and US argument. So a lot of that is a bit of marketing as well, to say progressive and Bitcoiner, I thought those two things can't go together. Well, it can, and here's why. So a bit of that is marketing, but also I'd like to try to reclaim that word from what people associate it with in this day and age, which I'd also love to talk to you about privacy and a lot of this as well. And another thing we'll get into, this episode is being recorded on September 11th, today, and it'll come out in a few weeks. There's a lot of privacy things that came out of such a horrendous attack on our country that we could probably talk about and reflect on that
Mhm.
some folks in the left might not like to talk about as much. I don't think they'd be against advocating for privacy tech and things like that. So,
It'd also be
so
kind of
again,
fun to talk about like what we think the left is
yeah.
today. Um,
If you have an answer for that, let me know.
I mean that term gets like thrown around a lot, and
Yeah.
I think that it's very obviously very loaded term,
Mhm.
and particularly in American politics today, I think I probably wouldn't agree that like with like say a lot a lot of people's definition of the left on the right. I think the what people call the left today in the U.S. right is a conglomeration of various political ideologies, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I in the way that I use these terms, like I don't think that like liberals and progressives are really while they are allying themselves under the big tent, say, of the Democratic Party, it's pretty clear to me that like they actually occupy different parts of the ideological spectrum, and you see this
Mhm.
play out in terms of like internal party fighting between the left wing, they call it the left wing, and the moderates, all stuff.
Yep.
And the left is like a pretty like complicated like beast as it's defined in that broad way. Curious to I'll be honest, I'm not even quite sure about what your politics are, but like
Mhm.
I'd be curious to sort of narrow in on what we're talking about there, especially if we're going to talk about polarization and what it means and what's going on. So
Yeah.
in the world and even within Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, I think, gosh, there's so many levels to that too. Because right now, let's say, just one of the reasons that I was interested in doing this podcast, having these conversations, is for better or for worse. Let's just take it net neutral. There's not a lot of diversity in specifically Bitcoin media outlets
Mhm.
in terms of talking about these type of things, or targeted at progressives. Now, for me, I'm like, if we're going to hit Bitcoin mainstream adoption and not have it be so polarized, I want to try to tap into that and show progressives in the left that we can have these Bitcoin conversations. And here's how it can align to very, very broad progressive values, such as the environment, such as social justice, such as inequality. Not that it solves all those things, but here are some steps that can be taken. And not as a way to create infighting or to say, oh, this is why they are wrong or this group is wrong, but to say, oh, Bitcoin is inclusive of everyone, including you progressives that your leaders are lying to you about, or whatever. So that was the initial thing. My personal politics that kind of come through in this podcast and other writings, like I draw so much inspiration from so many folks in the space, and Margot Paez and I have touched on this a lot in terms of those original libertarian leanings, right? Ben DeWall from over in Europe as well is such a great example of this. Those early libertarian, left leaning, cypherpunk type and Occupy movements, that kind of draws me into Bitcoin in that regard. Right. And this podcast definitely is not any type of platform where I'm like, okay, we're messaging to Democrats. I kind of articulated saying we're messaging to those that have progressive values that Bitcoin might be able to tap into, and very broadly speaking, the ones that I just mentioned to you. And then along the way, it's just adapting, growing, get feedback, hear other conversations, and really just trying to widen the tent of who's talking about Bitcoin and show who else is talking about Bitcoin in the world, because it's very big and expansive. And it's a shame that a lot of people in the US associate it far too much with right wing ideology or US based libertarian ideology. And nothing specifically against that. It's more like having Bitcoin pigeonholed into that is a
It's a
big
super
deal.
fun and like fascinating. I've talked about it a little bit, but it's like, but it. I mean, I guess it's like a little bit fun to unpack because one, like you referred to the episode I did with Peter McCormick about a year ago. It was about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago.
Mm.
Um, that where I sort of talked about my like ideological journey into libertarianism, deep into libertarianism. In
Mhm.
fact, like a lot of my friends today, still hail from that sort of era of my life. And I think like one of the things about human nature ultimately is it's very seductive to have like really strong, self-consistent and easy to understand narratives
Mhm.
that at least on the surface appear to fit together. We very much like the idea that that there's no like things are simple, like the follow the golden rule. There, the like the do unto others what you want others to do unto you. That's like all you need. The non-aggression principle. All these like really simplified principles that appear to provide like a self-consistent ethic. And I think that Bitcoin can, pull you in with that same sort of seduction, and you can look at it and you can kind of be blown away by the fact that you have this system that has these properties that through adversarial dynamics of the network, it becomes more secure, and it's censorship resistant, has all these properties, and doesn't can't the supply of money on the system can't be manipulated by any third party. And then you start to think to yourself, like, well, like money seems to be at the heart of the economy, and if that's true, then like, isn't it a seductive story to say that rebuilding an economy around something that is so pure and inviolable that it must just be true that we should accept the implications of this. We should accept the implications of decentralization as a tenant that might mean like the abandonment of the idea of the state, and like it's not like actually like hard for me to like understand like why people walk down this path, and these like dominoes start to fall, and you start to get to what you think is this like very self-consistent view of the universe and the world. Mm-hmm. I think for, this is going to sound very like elitist, and I don't know how else to say it, but I would say like, for the more like philosophically trained among us, like there comes a point where you recognize that those reductions and those simplicities that you try to sort of put into that like sort of base layer of understanding of the world will often lead you astray, because the world ends up being orders of magnitude more complex than you think it is. And then you eventually start to realize that the world we live in is not one that's based on some like simple foundation like that. It's actually, we exist in this world of, to quote complexity theorists, like high levels of emergence. And those high levels of emergence are on top of really complicated processes in the world, of which includes our biology itself, right? Like our motivations. Like so much of human nature, right, is we think of human nature in these really like high level ways. Like we think about it in terms of morality and ethics and what you would do if someone punched you in the face. Those are the sort of like really like like easy to think about aspects of human nature. But the more subtle aspects of human nature, right? The fact that like I have a slight pain in my stomach right now, and I'm thinking about whether or not that means I'm hungry, or maybe I ate the wrong thing yesterday, and it's like making me think about like how long in this podcast am I going to be able to go on with this like tummy ache, and all these are like our life is like a conglomeration of all of these like biological incentives that feed into a very, very complex nature that makes like really pinning down, any simplistic theory of like, a perfect way of organizing society really, really difficult. And actually, the more you learn about, the like these aspects of, of biology, human behavior, anthropology, the history of political and moral thought, you do start to like come to a very like, I guess what's the word I'm looking for? I apologize. I didn't get much sleep last night, by the way. I had a great
no, you're good.
Yesterday.
You're not the first guest I've talked to in the Bitcoin space that hasn't gotten a lot of sleep. So let's put that there.
But like, yeah, you become very modest about what you think you know, right? Mm-hmm. There's something to be said for the more you learn, the less you know. Mm-hmm. And it's actually very true, because the more you learn more about the limits of knowledge itself, right? You know, in this sort of like world of like magical complexity that we occupy, that we take for granted. And that's like really, I think, what separates me from a lot of the people on the other side of this conversation that are insisting that Bitcoin is a certain like this catch-all solution to the world. What a philosopher might describe my philosophical approach to Bitcoin would be to use the term instrumentalist, meaning that, like, I think of Bitcoin as a tool, like an instrument by which, like, positive incentives can be introduced to a complex system that don't currently exist, and can counteract the negative incentives that are coming in from other aspects of that system. And that's like, and honestly, like that sounds like very like demeaning and minimizing and like very uninspiring. But the reality is when you're trying to advance the world, those things are what real change looks like, right? Like, I mean, that's what durable change is. It's the successful modification of incentives over time, and that is like the way that like I approach Bitcoin. And I realize that doing that, and I use the word durable there, and I use it very intentionally, meaning that I don't mean durable in the sense that, like, from a technological perspective, that the cryptography is sound. I mean in a social and political sense, in the sense that, the incentives that interface with the rest of the world in and around a technology like Bitcoin are self-reinforcing. And there's reasons to believe that if certain things don't happen, they won't be. And so I am very much focused on trying to like push towards that world, which some people will sometimes attack as working within the system, because they have that other group of thinkers that have created this sort of self-consistent narrative from Bitcoin all the way to the top of culture, see that as sort of like almost like a betrayal of what they see as an opportunity to completely rebuild the institutional frameworks of society from the ground up. And I don't agree that that's doable or reasonable or even like desirable, for reasons that I think I got into a little bit more detail on with Peter McCormick. But I think, like, if we're kind of trying to really talk in the abstract principles, like that's kind of like how I see myself and how I position myself. And that is like in a sense like a very political position, right? Like, to be instrumentalist about Bitcoin is to be political, but like to be instrumentalist about Bitcoin isn't to be political in the sense that like it ascribes itself to a politics of like libertarianism or conservatism or liberalism. I mean, there's certainly political ideas that can exist. Like for example, like free speech is a political idea. It's one that happens to be shared by many ideological worldviews. And I'm happy for that. And I kind of view Bitcoin the same way, right? Like the idea that like we should have a digitally native currency on the internet that allows the global movement of value outside the control of private interests or government interests. And I think that can be something in the same way that free speech can be seen. I mean, we could even argue it's a form of free speech at the end of the day. Like money is ultimately information. That's very political. But you can overload that politics in a way that I object to. And so that's how I see it.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the BitBox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank BitBox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. I think most people, it's not intentional this way, but I think most people that I've had on the podcast that are seeing these use cases of Bitcoin, and I think one of the greatest articulations is Bitcoin as a tool. So I try to say that phrase over and over again, like Bitcoin is a tool that can address certain things and start to address other things, right? Because I've had several other guests on as well, and I forget who exactly was talking about it, but it's not going to fix politics overnight or maybe ever. It's not going to fix power dynamics.
It'll never fit. It'll never fix politics.
Yeah, or like, campaign finance or like dictators. It can be a check on power, and there's different ways of saying, okay, if every citizen of Togo starts using Bitcoin instead of the local currency, that yes, that will inevitably topple a dictatorship if they can't fund their war operation. There's different arguments to be made there. But yeah, Bitcoin as a tool and setting forward realistic expectations, I think is going to drive more adoption, drive more success. And I'm a fervent arguer and supporter of, okay, we need these societal and cultural layers of Bitcoin. And there's so many different people that say it, but Evan from our team who works on our website and all sorts of other stuff talks about how layer one or layer zero is people. Layer zero is people. Without people believing in your technology, in your movement, it's not going to happen. Even if Bitcoin is the greatest thing that has ever happened or greatest invention ever come to be, it won't happen without people. It won't happen without movements. It won't happen without these things, at least in my opinion. It's not inevitable.
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. That's like the right, like, I don't know. I guess I kind of like that. I might steal that layer zeros people. But the reality is that if Bitcoin was the obvious off-ramp from, say, something even like inflation or hyperinflation, I mean, it should stand to reason that, there was, earlier this year, right, for instance, and this kind of was an example of me sort of taking a strident position. I kind of felt like I was standing against most of Bitcoin Twitter and Nostr and the various places in which these conversations happen, in terms of like pushing back against the prediction of hyper Bitcoinization. And there was a sense among a lot of Bitcoiners when Silicon Valley Bank fell into trouble and the government and in particular the Federal Reserve started to put into place, emergency lending vehicles in which banks could, deal with the duration problems of the treasuries that they were holding on their balance sheets as a result of the rapid rise in interest rates that ultimately came face to face with the long dated, low yielding bonds that these banks were holding on their balance sheet. In the case of SVB, led to extreme distress on the bank. There were many Bitcoiners that were saying this was the beginning of the complete collapse of the United States.
This is it.
The United States dollar, effectively, the banking system, and then the dollar. There were many prominent Bitcoiners who were saying you basically had 3 or 4 months to get into Bitcoin before the dollar went to zero. And it's these are this is obviously not true, right? And the way that we know that this is not true is for the very reason that you're pointing out around people, because people have a vested interest in the survival of the U.S. dollar, right?
Billions of people rely on it. Again, whether they want to or not, it is de facto.
Yeah, like this idea that there is going to be a sudden awakening one day where a majority of Americans, I'm not even gonna or even a plurality of Americans, not even make it a majority, decide that they are basically ready to begin completely deconstructing their entire financial life, everything from the way they pay their bills to their mortgage to their investment portfolios, their 401ks. And they're just like, you know what? I'm ready to get rid of all of this and just hodl Bitcoin instead. And that this is going to happen because everyone's just going to realize how corrupt it is that the Federal Reserve has control over the money supply, and that it's like a racket, and that, the fact that like Wall Street has access to pre-inflationary money, and that has wealth effects like that, emerges in the Cantillon effect. And Americans are just going to like be like, wait a second, this is bullshit. Like, why aren't we just switching to Bitcoin right now? And it's surprising to me that like a lot of Bitcoiners actually believe that moment is like, or at least was near, when Silicon Valley Bank and then, and Silvergate and Signature Bank fell into distress. I like sent some pretty strident tweets saying that like, this is nonsense. It's absolutely not going to happen. Like, of course, like not only is the government going to do everything they can to make sure that this doesn't pancake into another financial crisis, the vast majority of Americans are going to approve of those measures. They are not going to be mad about them. Like the fact that like people think that, people are going to be super mad that the government is violating free market principles, that the government isn't allowing the marbles to, ultimately roll the way they're going to roll and let the chips lie where they're going to lie, and that they're going to interfere with the machinations of an unmolested free market. And that's going to offend the average American. It's just not true. Like the average American wants the government to not allow the banking system to collapse because they want to continue to live their lives and not have to be in a state of crisis. And so this is like, this is very much related to your point in the sense that you have to think about the incentives of the average person if you want the average person to see value in this. Now, I think that the average person will see value in this, but I don't think it's going to be especially in the case of the United States here, or in Western, developed countries with highly developed banking systems and advanced capital markets, that they're going to be in this race to the exits from what we refer to as the fiat banking system. Now, there's there's different contexts around the world where those things are not true, and Bitcoin to me looks a lot more interesting in the short term. And I also think Bitcoin looks very interesting in the short term, even within developing economies, right? As a new asset class and as a way to move money around the world, right? Across border, without friction, in a decentralized, non-censorable way. But like that's because there are real people incentives that lead me in the direction of believing that like Bitcoin can and will be and has been adopted for those sorts of contexts. But it's going to be a long journey. I think the Bitcoiners who say it's early are right. It is early in this. It's probably like very early. Like we're probably decades away from like a true rebuilding of the global financial system where, something like Bitcoin will find itself at the center of, a global realignment of how value is moved around the world. And that doesn't mean that there isn't like really interesting use cases. We're certainly working on those use cases today. But yeah, it's not going to be like that. It's not going to be this moment in time where the world just resets itself onto Bitcoin. I just don't believe, like, there's nothing believable about that for me.
Yeah. I think I go most of the way where you are, and I'm not saying, okay, let me find ways to push back against Mike here. So I agree with what you're saying. I think
no, it's more fun if you do.
No, I know. And I know it is too, especially there's so many listeners, but quick aside, that want me to like just bring someone on just to be like, just have a disagreement argument. I'm like, you guys are still in that Twitter zone where you want to just listen to people fighting and disagreeing. No, I think my only little bit of pushback is those, let's metaphorically use it, these black swan events of, and I've said this many times on the podcast, I didn't truly jump into Bitcoin kind of as this like, oh my gosh, endeavor until like February, March of 2021. So I'm very new to it. I've read a lot of the history of Bitcoin and all of the different movements and block size wars and all of this stuff. But I think there are some things that have already started to happen that are like, huh, that's interesting. Even like BlackRock, different use cases, different, even the block size war itself.
But that fits into the use case I was talking about, right? Like as a, as like a new set of like asset class and, international, international like monetary asset. And I think like the BlackRock application for an ETF certainly like fits into the use cases I kind of enumerated. And I think I think things like that are going to kind of drip over the next few years. And that's very exciting. And I'm very excited that these things are starting to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most likely outcome. And then there's also things like state adoption, like El Salvador. And then there's other black swan events that, in my head, in terms of obviously the political cycle will continue to get more and more messy. And I think Bitcoin will be talked. I don't think Bitcoin will be the topic.
I don't know that the political cycle is
discussed.
going to keep getting messier and messier. This is a fun. I know we don't want to get. I don't want to get into partisan politics, but I just want to say that like I am of the opinion that, and I know it's hard for people to believe because of like the current absurdity of politics, but I actually think things are calming down in many different ways. Right. I am actually kind of pretty optimistic that we're in a sort of like decompression now from like the intensity of political divisions. Now, I don't know that means that like that the nonsense of partisanship in the United States in particular is going to like, go away, because there's certainly a lot of weird, perverse financial incentives that like rolls all the way up into the way that political fundraising works and how the media ecosystem works. But I actually think that like when you really take a step back, you see a lot of signs on both the left and the right of there being an exhaustion with extremism. Like you see this, you see even within the Democratic Party, even in like very like left-wing enclaves in the United States, you're seeing moderate politicians come to power in places like San Francisco and in Massachusetts. You're seeing this sort of rejection, even like within the left, of like, extreme identitarianism. And you're also starting to see, I mean, you're seeing some of that in the Republican primary now as well, right? Like trying to push back on that. And I see the way that I look at this is that, we've gone through a pretty traumatic decade. The 2010s were traumatic as hell for, the millennial generation and the Zoomers. I mean, starting with, the absolute boondoggle of the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the complete upending of politics with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and the COVID crisis, like social disorder, like the issues around like policing in the United States. Like it basically, I think it was like Noah Smith has sort of compared it to the 1970s. And I think that that's actually like very apt. And I think we're in like an actual sort of period now where a lot of people within their own political camps are now starting to like question like whether or not like they've sort of lost perspective on the fact that like there's actually really important like political policy goals that we need to really be thinking about, like where there are collective interests. You're seeing like I think for all of the talk about political polarization, one of the things that just doesn't get talked about enough is actually how much bipartisanship there's been in the last 2 to 3 years on China, on Russia, on, even on like environmental regulation. Like, I mean, there's like reform, like even like regulatory reform. There's even like increasing like bipartisan talk around like reforming something like NEPA in the United States to allow for, the more rapid deployment of infrastructure in the US. Like these are like things that like just like did not seem possible, say like in the mid 20 teens. And so I think there's like this really optimistic lens you can sort of put on the way that things are trending, and that there's like this real possibility that like if we can kind of get through the sort of changing of the guard, and we can see some of these like characters that are in our political space that are sort of dominating our attention go away. There seems to be a lot of appetite on both the left and the right for like calming down a little bit. And I like point to that a lot. And that's very optimistic. And people don't seem to like to hear optimism. Everyone seems to think that you're out to lunch if you're not saying completely cynical things, like believing that these trend lines are going to continue like continuously, like in an unending direction. But I don't know. I don't think political polarization is worsening right now. Like I hear people say that, but that's actually not my impression. So anyways, I know that was like a sidebar, but people say it all the time, and I wanted to take this opportunity to push back on it.
Yeah, well, I'd say initially the way I said the political cycle was in terms of, and again, not that this will make or break elections, it won't at this point, but in terms of Bitcoin, I do think, because right now, like, I'm here in Massachusetts, and Elizabeth Warren is my senator, and I try not to mention her every podcast episode. But one of the things, I agree with her on so many things, but Bitcoin obviously vehemently disagree. And so there's been a lot of folks on the left. A lot of folks on the left are just kind of like crypto neutral or agnostic, and kind of like, well, let's see, it could be this, but it could be that. That's a lot of it, right? So there's the extreme voices on either side having a specific opinion on Bitcoin, proof of work, mining, that kind of thing. I think those conversations could continue to heat up in really silly and annoying ways, because you have champions on the left, such as Elizabeth Warren, saying certain things. Then you have champions on the right, such as Ted Cruz, saying certain things. So Ted Cruz is like, well, they don't like it, so I'm gonna be for it. And I know people have different opinions on that. I think Ted Cruz does like it and does see a lot of things, but there's quite a bit of rhetoric in his voice about the Democrats don't want you to have blank, or the Democrats don't want you to have Bitcoin because it's freedom. And I'm like, stop saying that. Just talk about Bitcoin.
That's always, politics has always been like that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Like, yeah, I mean, like I think that's like kind of par for the course. I mean, that's what we're in a two-party system, which like honestly, like I wish we could get rid of the two-party system, but in a two-party system, like one of the incentives, right, is to try and blame everything bad on the other party and attribute everything good to yourself, right? Like that's just that's just where like the incentives of political rhetoric accrue. The real question is like when you get down to brass tacks, like, is there actual real agreement? I think there is, right? Like we see these bipartisan bills, right? Like market structure bills making their way through Congress for stable coins and for Bitcoin and crypto more broadly. Even though I don't really like that. I hope actually that Congress doesn't understep in some ways on what I see as like illegal securities dealing, but like, which I don't group Bitcoin or stable coins into that mix. But I once again, like there's plenty of bipartisan agreement there. And that was maybe one of the examples I should have listed in my diatribe about maybe things aren't getting worse from a polarization perspective. So yeah.
The one thing I would say is I think too, you might be feeling this, or I might understand some of what you're saying. So let's say at a behind the scenes, right? Just the networking of these different policies, these bills, the just things that churn throughout our country and just get things done. Let's say maybe that is a bit more bipartisan or this and that, but the surface level that people see, that people read with headlines, that people get into, that to me is still very much so brewing, even though maybe it's not based on reality. Maybe it's just campaign speech. Like, and I wonder part of it too, to push back a bit on what you're saying is, I'd say the left maybe is pulled back a little bit from what, again, not to get into a COVID argument. Like I believe in the use of vaccines. I shouldn't even have to say any of these things, right? But just kind of throwing that aside for a second, I think the left did pull back a bit from what I would consider is COVID hysteria, in terms of like, throwing everything at the wall because we didn't know what was going on. Some people did, and then kind of pulling back from that. Because some people, even my most liberal friends, be like, "All right, I think we went a little far. Let's pull back some of this, and let's get to a more steady place with this now that we know what it is."
That was sort of like, yeah, I mean, COVID was definitely an example of how the perverse incentives of the two-party system function in the United States.
Yeah.
And I look, I don't, I agree with you. I think that, I do think the left went too far in some ways in how it, in the rhetoric it used around COVID. But I also, I think that like there was like a polarization effect there that led to like, I think, irrational conclusions on both sides of the argument, right?
Yes.
Like,
Yep.
I think the sane, I think the sane, like hindsight 2020, like, description of COVID is that, one, we were in a fog of war situation where this COVID thing crept up on us very, very quickly. We had plenty of reasons to be deeply concerned about the public health and national security, given what had happened in Wuhan and in Italy. We were seeing hospitals become overloaded. It appeared to be a serious, serious threat to our collective safety. And, I've been on the record many times. I don't know how many times I've tweeted this. It seems probably that like the lockdowns were too much, and I would have preferred things like a strict mask policy, which obviously the more libertarian people think that that's a step too far, but I think that's ridiculous. I think the evidence that if everyone's wearing masks, you get like actually pretty good protection, like, into the 80s and 90s% less likely to spread. That's obviously contingent on everyone wearing masks, not just one person in the room. I think we rushed the development of a vaccine with new technology, with mRNA technology. I actually think that was a miracle of science. I think that anybody who knows the science knows that there was always a risk that there would be waning immunity as a result of this. This is actually a pretty typical problem. Typical is the wrong word, but a known problem with coronaviruses. There had been several attempts to create vaccines for the original SARS virus, and also MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, which is also a coronavirus that is at least in the same family as SARS-CoV-2, which is responsible for COVID-19. And there does seem to be an issue with immune memory in the human body as it pertains to the antibodies, all three, the inherent immunity as well as antibodies and the T cell response over time. Now, so in line with like previous vaccines that we've tried to develop in the past to deal with coronaviruses, we've seen this issue before where you start to see waning immunity in 3 to 6 months. And this was observed in our attempts to create vaccines for MERS and for the original SARS virus. And there were worries that this similar thing would happen. And so, we have seen waning immunity. Coronaviruses and RNA-based viruses are highly mutagenic. So you already had reasons to believe that new strains would pop up quite frequently, and that you'd kind of be in this sort of dog chasing its tail situation with trying to update vaccines. Now, but that doesn't mean that we did the wrong thing as a society by trying, even if the vaccine only lasted 6 months and it appears that's about the level of immunity you get from it. The scope of the crisis was huge. The fact that people are so outraged that they didn't tell us that it wouldn't protect us forever. Or they didn't tell us that it wouldn't spread. It's we didn't know. We didn't know. we were all operating in a fog of war and we did our best. And that is what society sometimes needs to do. It needs to close ranks and it needs to sort of collectively defend itself. And yes, we make mistakes. And hindsight 2020, you can look back and you can say, yeah, like, we got that wrong, and we got that wrong, and we got that wrong. And all these people who think like, look, I was right all along. I knew this. I just followed my libertarian principles. And if we all followed our libertarian principles, we'd never make any of these mistakes. No, like the reality is if we followed those principles and we were actually facing, say, a pandemic that was of much, much greater danger, that had, say, I don't know, something insane like 40 to 50% fatality rate, like those measures would absolutely be reasonable, like by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, I mean, like I've probably said a bunch of things now that piss off both the left and the right in this conversation, and I do think that that's like ultimately like where the truth does lie. And yeah, I think political polarization, yeah, it is unfortunate how it's made like having a conversation about this like really, really hard. And I don't know, maybe I've gotten myself in a bunch of trouble by saying a lot of this out loud, but like I happen to think that is just like the way it is, and I am willing to forgive, politicians and public health officials who made mistakes under those circumstances, because like what else were they supposed to do given what they knew at the very beginning of the pandemic? Like, it appeared to be a pretty. I think it's very rich too for certain people. I'm not going to mention people by name, but there are people that I saw predicted absolute disaster in the beginning. One particular individual I won't call out, who was very alarmist about COVID as it spread in Wuhan, and now takes a very like some uninterrogated libertarian position about how wrong it was for us to undertake any public health response at all. And such person is seen as like an intellectual giant. And I won't call said person out, but like, yeah, like the hypocrisy is insane. And I'm far more forgiving of people who operate under such circumstances.
Yeah, and I think the important thing here too is obviously just nuance in every conversation. Like for me personally, which we'll see what else we can get into with the time left here, but for me too, like I have taken a huge step back from Twitter X, been more active in Noster, which I want to touch with you on because you were and then you're not, and I'm hoping that you'll come back a little bit because so I pull back from Twitter. We post on there for the podcast because I want to try to have the podcast be accessible to everyone, regardless if you agree with my methods of decentralization and the tech that I'm using to put out there. But back to the polarization point, I guess I hope you're right with where we're headed. I feel like it's such cycles, right? We kind of pull back a little bit, then we ramp up again, we pull back and ramp up, and it's happening faster and faster. It used to be stretches of like 8-10 years. Now it's like 1-2 years. And I think the height of everything was COVID, right? It was post Obama and people being really disappointed there. It was, the progressives and left being burnt by Bernie and the DNC and all of these things. And then it was COVID and Trump and all of this. So I do hope that we're at a bit of height of this. The other complex factors are where we're at in the world with Russia, Ukraine, where we're at with China, Taiwan. There's so many other unpredictable things. But I guess my fear, and I'll put my personal opinion out here in terms of what I'm seeing from the right, in my opinion, is more of a normalization of things that I would say are specifically anti-freedom. So people talk about being freedom maximalists, and I'm like, how can you say that when I've seen a lot of folks, local, state, from the right? What I'm deeply concerned about is just less access to like healthcare rights, more attacks and rampant attacks of the gay and trans communities, less abortion access and all of these things. I'm as a progressive, I'm deeply concerned about that rhetoric, even if, let's say, on the ground level, some state laws haven't changed or some things haven't changed. The rhetoric of which it is very normal at a national campaign level to be saying certain things now that weren't previously said is alarming to me. And at best case scenario, I'm like, that's just disrespectful and hypocritical and just ridiculous. Like, why do you care so much about that? At worst, it's affecting people. People are dying. People are being hurt. And again, I'm also a free speech maximalist. My personal opinion is get it out there so we can see all the ugly. Don't try to hide the ugly. Like get it out there. Let's as a society open up about what we actually feel as a country, right? And there's some deep. So for me, I do think there's deep divisions in our country that I don't know. I don't know where we go with certain. I'm not saying we need to split or we need to do the city state narratives or this, but I don't know. I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm not. Well, here's the thing. I'm not a maximalist about anything. The once again, the failed political philosopher in me. When I hear the word maximalist, I think of things like Trotskyism and like stuff like that. Where
yeah, sure. Yeah.
Where I'm like, where I think that the look. I think there is a real political undercurrent today that is a holdover from the culture wars of the last 10 years that is way more politically powerful than it deserves to be based on where the average American is.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I really like to do, and I like to try to prove to people that at the base layer of society, America is nowhere as close to divided as it appears to be in the media and on X.com, is just looking at like what Americans think on policy by policy views,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like when you go to say Pew polling or Gallup polling, where they do public policy polling on everything from like how high do Americans think taxes should be on the rich to like whether or not there should be single payer healthcare, which you just mentioned, like you mentioned like healthcare. It turns out that there is pretty broad consensuses. Like you actually find that like 60 to 70% of Americans have generally aligned views, even on things like immigration.
The environment as well has rapidly changed in terms of almost complete agreements, maybe on what it is since the 1980s, right?
Yeah,
if you look at that, that's incredible. Yeah.
Nearly 90% of Americans think that an assault weapons ban would be reasonable. Better background checks. Over 60% of Americans believe that the government should take action on climate change. So like there like this idea that like the polarization we see is actually the result of a constituency capture by the two party system.
Yeah. Well, that's my fear, Mike. So that's my fear, is that I agree with you. How do we? Well, for me, decentralizing as much as makes sense is one step in that direction. But how do we have people understand that that's actually where we're at as a country, not these small group of very, very powerful and rich people, politicians, whatever, are saying, this is why you're divided. This is why you're different.
Yeah.
This is where we disagree. And we have to. That they still have a very large megaphone compared to what the actual majority underlying agreement is, as you mentioned, which I'm glad you're saying all that. And I'm glad we can amplify that. I think that's true. And leads me to what will probably be the title of this episode, is like, we're not as divided as you think, right?
Well, we're not as divided as we think, but obviously the media, like our media ecosystem, our information ecosystem more broadly, and the way that our politics works is in a very dangerous place. There's no doubt about that. I think you mentioned Noster and like why I am or am not on it. I think that that's like an example of I think the kind of immune response to the sorts of perverse incentives we're seeing. The thing I worry about the most in our society is the fact that we're self-sorting ourselves into echo chambers, and it's inside echo chambers where extremism ultimately manifests itself. There's been many sociological studies that have been done on this. What they found is that if you take a group of people that all generally agree on the same things, Like just like generally speaking, like let's just say that like you have, you know, several people who think they agree broadly on things like, taxes should be lower, business regulation should be, like minimized, and et cetera, et cetera. Just sort of these kind of very like just take very like pedestrian center right positions in the United States, and take a bunch of these people and put them in a room and have them talk about issues for several days. What people have found is that in that echo chamber, people don't just come to realize they agree. They make each other more extreme. They become more strident. They actually move further to the right, and the same thing happens on the left. I'm not meaning to single out just the right or a left. When you're making an example, you're going to pick an example one way or the other. And this happens too, and it's one of the reasons why. I think I'm pretty critical of the way left wing politics has captured like campus culture in the United States. Not because like I don't have a lot of like agreement with like, I consider myself like pretty socially progressive, like net, like like if you take full accounting of my positions on these things, someone might even ascribe the word woke to me or something like based on the things that I believe. But I definitely think that, the left has done similar things to itself and driving itself to not extremes and say some of the same ways that you're alluding to, but like losing its capacity for self-criticism, losing its capacity for like being able to hear dissent, which is like very, very important. So like this is what actually takes me back to like, I think like maybe like why I kind of stepped away from Nostr, not because I like don't like Nostr, or quite honestly, like I've actually been trying to step away from all types of social media because of the echo chamber effects that happen. Like, I just don't like it when I'm in an environment where everyone is more or less saying the same things, and not just saying the same things, trying to come up with more and more creative idioms to express a purity of views on something. So I got like kind of mocked quite harshly for criticizing meme culture for this reason, because I view like meme culture in some ways as a manifestation of this, a way of trying to take a position, like a position that you're sort of implicitly suggesting is the correct position, probably using something like a meme to mock people who don't share that position, and also to drive a more puritanical sort of view on that position, one where the actual argument is essentially considered beyond reproach, that like there's nothing that can be said about it. Like when you start to say things like Bitcoin has already won, Bitcoin is inevitable, it's like, okay, well, like you're now saying things that like preclude the idea that like you could be wrong. You're now talking in terms of absolutism. Like that is like that is the seeds of extremism. I'm not trying to say that like the Bitcoin maxi crowd or whatever are extremists. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying once you get yourself into that echo chamber, and that is the mode of communication that you prefer, like you can say it's just having fun and making jokes. But I mean, that's how a lot of these political memes started too. I mean, a lot of what happened, like things like QAnon and like the whole like phenomenon in 2016 of like the rise of the alt-right also all started with funny political memes on like 4chan, and then eventually like 8chan. And like,
did you see that documentary, by the way? I think it was Max or HBO. Oh man, this filmmaker, I think it was like The Q Story or Q. I think it's just called Q. Maybe it's a series. If you haven't, you should check it out. I mean, you probably know all of this already, but fantastic coverage of it. But it was like a couple of years ago.
It's all fun and games until it isn't.
Yeah,
like that, and so I mean, probably I don't know how many people I've now offended by like saying all this, because I know how meme culture is like considered super important and foundational to what Bitcoin is. And I'm not trying to say that a lot of it isn't just fun and games, but what I am saying is like if it is your goal to convince people that you're right and they're wrong, or your goal is to, create like empathy in order for people to be able to like relate to you such that like you can persuade them. Yeah, I mean, like these are probably very ineffective ways of doing that. If anything, it just, once you start talking in like these like coded languages where you can't get the joke unless you're part of the community. Well, that's exclusionary social behavior, right? If you're like, the way in which you create community is through metaphorical secret handshakes of like funny inside jokes. Well, I mean, those things are fun and they can knit together community. And I'm not trying to say that there aren't positives to that, but it's like, what is your goal? Like if your goal is merely to like, convince yourself that you're right, well, and the way and if you think to yourself, well, I don't have to convince anyone because Bitcoin is inevitable. You probably are like walking like in the direction of something that could be described as radicalization and extremism, at least in some form. Maybe not a dangerous form. I'm not like literally trying to say that like it's dangerous in the same way that like I think like white supremacy is dangerous, but at least like intellectually dangerous in the sense that like you're precluding the idea that like you're missing nuance, or that there's some aspect of the world that that won't cleanly interface with your ideas, and that needs to be reconciled in some way, that there needs to be some sort of compromise. And I believe that like it is in those places where society functions, where society is knitted together, where we truly can live in a world where we can resolve our disputes peacefully and through legal processes and civil processes and private processes, without having to resort to walking out on the street and having a shootout at 12 noon. Like that's like ultimately where I'm trying to be. And so I think I left, like I kind of stepped away from Nostr because I felt, and by the way, it's not surprising that it's an echo chamber, because you got all the early adopters in there, right? That are all like super excited about the technology and they're super excited about Bitcoin. And I guess I was like, well, that's not all I want to talk about.
Yeah.
That's what it was. It wasn't some like, I wasn't like, I didn't like step away like kind of consciously because I was like trying to like send a message that I don't like Nostr. I think it's cool and I want it to be successful, but like for me it was really all about me and the conversation that I wanted to be in.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, still you can look up. I think it's, oh my gosh, is it Nostr.stats? No, I think I put it in show notes before, but there's like still 8,000 to 10,000 daily users, like active users in terms of actually posting notes on Nostr for the globe, all relays. So that tells you right there. And I think, me being someone who's been on Nostr since December 2022, I'm definitely buying into like, oh, we're talking at a family picnic. And sometimes I push back against that a little bit, just saying, okay, if we want it to go mainstream, let's try this, and that. So it's those early conversations. But I do hear you on that. And I think going back to some of that polarization and that extremism that you're describing, that extreme ideology of I'm right, that's the only answer. I think a lot of it that I've posted about before is this position of kind of privilege or entitlement. So there've been some Bitcoiners that were, I view it as lucky enough or crazy enough early on to buy into Bitcoin and actually be financially pretty wealthy from the Bitcoins they've accumulated. Yeah. So a lot of these folks might feel very entitled. They might have been right about a few things. So they're like, well, I'm going to be right forever. And it doesn't mean they're going to be wrong, but I think what I'm trying to tell people is, hey, I came into 2021 and I had to push through a lot of bullshit that was really hard for me, but I grew up in a very conservative area in the South. I grew up religious. I'm not anymore. I knew how to understand different dynamics of what I'm seeing in similar ways to the dogma of what some of Bitcoin has been. And I think it's getting better. Luckily, I think Jameson Lopp does a great job of writing about these things of Bitcoin maxi culture, but he and I would disagree on a lot of politics. He's just observing it like this cultural phenomenon that it is. And I'm trying to say, when you come off this way, it comes off entitled, and it may push certain people off. Then they might say, well, they're not good for it anyway. Well, they should be able to, or that's not the target audience anyway. It's like, well, everyone's the target audience here. I'm just saying, you're coming off this way when you do that. Do what you want. Like, absolutely, 100% do what you want. But I think this is how it's coming across. And hopefully that's trending in a bit more of a mainstream way, I think. But I agree with you with that meme culture. And I like it, but I see your points as well about what it can send.
Yeah, it's a very nuanced point. Like, I'm not like saying that you're doing evil if you're doing memes. It's not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's sort of a like when it gets to a point where that community like basically only understands its own memes, and those memes are sort of like a language by which you're just sort of shit talking people who don't agree with you, and you're just like showing like, you know, the approbation for the people that do. That's social exclusionary behavior. It's not it's not the most effective way to convince people that they should take a different look. Now, I mean, I've said that to people, and a lot of people have said, well, I don't care. It's like funny, like screw people. And it's like, okay. And a lot of those people think, yeah, like Bitcoin has already won, and people just don't realize that hyper Bitcoinization is coming, and everyone's an idiot for not realizing that. Well, I mean, those people are not convincible. Like, so I'm not like trying to argue with them to the extent that I criticize that view. It's only to like, that's my attempt to basically say to the outside world that, look, like there are other ways to like think about Bitcoin that are not in these incredibly narrow black and white terms. That there is a more nuanced and I think, like, honestly, near-term interesting set of applications for Bitcoin that like we can be investing in, that we can be building towards. And so, yeah, like when I criticize those things, I'm not really like seeking an argument with the unconvincible. I'm trying to draw a contrast, and that's my purpose and pushing on that.
Yeah, I think that's what you've, and I kind of identify with a lot of what you're doing, a lot of the things I advocated for in the space. Yes, I personally would align myself with a lot of left and progressive values, but a lot of the reason I'm doing that is because I see such little of it vocally in the space. And I have so many people on the sidelines either messaging me or I've talked to at meetups or in person that are just like, hey, I agree with that, but I just am not vocal about it. I don't want to be shit on, or I just want to stack and hodl. And I'm like, that's great. Or they just want to use Bitcoin. They don't want to be a part of like the conversations and stuff. I personally am interested in that, but that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I think that's probably why you're doing what you're doing too.
But that's how you kind of know, like, you're in an echo chamber, and I get those too. Like, you have no idea, like, how many DMs I get from people. They're like, oh my God, like, thank you for saying this. I've been in Bitcoin for 5 or 6 years. I agree with you 100%, but I would never say that publicly. Like that's like kind of, I mean, it sounds like what I would expect to hear from, say, someone in the Republican Party that like privately doesn't like the leading presidential candidate. It's like, I can't say that publicly. Like, it's like, well, Bitcoin's not a political party. Like, why do you feel like you can't say that? Like, that's actually like that to me is actually very concerning about like the state of Bitcoin culture. When I get people telling me how brave I mean, I don't feel brave. I feel like I've just kind of always been this way, that I've always just been willing to speak my mind. I don't really care that much if like the room doesn't like what I'm saying, as long as I think it's right. But it's certainly concerning to me that like I hear that. Like, so when I went to Bitcoin Miami this year, I didn't know how I was going to feel about it, because I had sort of said a lot of like hypercritical things about like Bitcoin maximalism and anti-hyper Bitcoinization takes. And one of the things that very quickly happened while I was walking around that conference was how many people stopped me and thanked me for saying these things. And which I think like points to, I think, a sense of like like there is a lot more diversity of opinion in Bitcoin than appears on the surface, but very, very loud voices have literally made people feel like I won't be able to be part of this community if I say very publicly what I think, because it doesn't like line up with the orthodoxy of like, this person or that person who is like a luminary of the Bitcoin movement and has written this book. And like, once again, I'm not going to name names, but like, yeah, I mean, it's little it seems a bit crazy to me. So that's let's be honest, that's a bad sign about the state of the culture. That's like anti-inclusive. There's clearly people who sort of act essentially as stewards and controllers of the Bitcoin narrative and the culture and what is right and what is wrong. And you have a lot of people who are sort of swimming around the outside edges thinking, well, I don't think that.
Yeah.
I don't want everyone to unfollow me and block me on Twitter. So I'm just going to stick to talking about hodling, I guess. Like that.
Yeah, or just talk about the finances, or just like, I posted this recently too. I'm like, listen, like we talk about decentralization, we talk about all of these things in Bitcoin, then be that yourself. Like if you have an opinion, there are some people in the Bitcoin community that say to me personally, I'm like, that is a wild thing to say, but go for it. Like we're a big, diverse community. Like just don't be hateful to people, and don't talk about how you want to physically harm someone. Or can we agree to some basic tenets here, right? Which some people might not even agree to. But I'm like, if you're coming from a different position, like put it out there. But also there's people that message me and from different communities. They're like, hey, I'm from the trans community and I'm really into Bitcoin, but I'm not sure how to. I had literally had someone message me that and said, just thank you for like saying something during Pride, which to me, like in my daily life and here in, again, Massachusetts, I know woke, liberal, whatever, that's just very normal part of the culture. In my opinion, I live in a very inclusive area that I love, that anybody can just be whoever they want to be, right? For me personally. So I live and breathe that daily. And then I dip my toes into some Bitcoin conversation. It's like, oh, people find that very interesting or odd or whatever. But I try not to think too much about that. Now, again, I try not to post intentionally, like I'm going to post this so that I get a reaction, or say that, no, I want to be a presence in the community. But you're right. It's clearly it's an echo chamber by those different conversations we've had with folks and so many others that I've heard. That's not a great sign.
It's, I mean, it's very frustrating. Like, I know I'm like, I think when you reach a point where you're basically describing everything bad in the world as fiat,
Sure,
like you've really lost the plot.
Yeah. Well, it's silly. I view it as kind of silly. And
like when one like certain, like I promised I wouldn't mention names, but I won't, but I'll let people like figure out who I'm talking about. But when someone writes a book about Bitcoin and dedicates at least like several pages to talking about how fiat is responsible for degenerate and modern art, and this person is like considered like a luminary and leading intellectual of the Bitcoin movement. I mean, I don't really like know what to make of that, other than that does actually seem like incredibly extreme to me, in a bordering on dangerous way. But yeah, so like, yeah, and the fact that like that even me saying this like should feel uncomfortable when it's so obviously crazy, like to say that, like whether you like Bitcoin or not, but because of that person is like a literal mascot of Bitcoin to a lot of people, that seems like you shouldn't be able to say something like that, like is like crazy to me. Like that to me makes me very like feel like I just want to kind of work on Bitcoin in my own way and like stay out of this whole thing.
Yeah, which is honestly fine if people want to approach it in any sort of way, such as I want to work on my own or I want to do this. But it's like, there are more diverse voices here. There are people that are going to vehemently disagree with that, and I'm going to make sure we have nuanced conversations on here that include that. And a lot of people aren't on board with him or that message. By the way, so many more now than even when I came into Bitcoin 2 years ago. Which is, it feels like a lifetime, but it's only been 2 years. But I want to make sure too we get to talking a little bit about some more ways that not intentionally here, but just kind of on my list
I'm
of
pretty sure Picasso has nothing to do with fiat money, just to be clear.
you might be right. Yeah. No, well, again, you're getting to the point of, and I think a driving theme that I've seen from you is like, can we stop making extreme claims about all encompassing things of Bitcoin is going to fix the world in this way, or this is the result of all the ailments in the world, right? It's kind of like when I was in college, I said this when I first went on Peter's podcast back or earlier this year, but I said he was like, are you a commie? And I was like, well, when I was in college, I was very deep into Marxist, deep left thinking and philosophy. And I studied a lot of that in social theory and sociology. It made sense. But then along the years, I also read a lot of different folks. And I'm like, there might not be one underlying current of what is wrong with everything in the world, right? And I see both sides doing that in extreme ways. And I think, like you say, I might not agree with everything you're saying even here on this episode, but you're trying to address nuance and that there's nuance to almost everything in life. And for me personally, I probably don't engage as much on social media anymore in that way because for me, I can't get into the nuance on Twitter. I can't get into the nuance. I can try to get a little bit more into the nuance in person conversations through this podcast. So for me, I try to get into more of the nuance in an hour and a half conversation. And even then it's still a drop in the bucket, but whatever. And I see you doing that same thing.
No, I love disagreement. Like I've said this before, and it's like actually true that so many of my good friends, and like even my own like significant other, right? Like I don't share politics and never have really. Like I've never struggled with this idea that like, that like ideological like disagreement is not just like part of life. Like people have different life experiences. Those experiences inform their view of the world. They have different levels of understanding. And the one thing that I really care about ultimately, right, is that I really just like separate people's politics into like two broad categories, right? Like there's people who, I was actually thinking about. I was one of the idiots that everyone was making fun of for being trapped at Burning Man. Recently,
we should have started with that.
Yeah, no, and while I was there, actually, I was at Burning Man. I was actually thinking a lot about this, and I haven't really
trapped at Burning Man with Mike Brock. That'll be the title.
It's trapped at Burning Man, and I was thinking a lot about really this like sort of like the two, what I see as like the two broad categories of like people in the world, and these people exist up in the elite circles, like in the corporate boardrooms, in the halls of power, both in democracies and authoritarian states alike. And I sort people into two groups. Like there's the cynics and there's the romantics. And the cynics, right, and romantics, like both, at a certain point, like, first of all, I consider myself a romantic, but like I can see the game for what it is. Like I can see the fact that, a lot of things that happen in the world happen because of like narrow economic interests or self-rationalization or, ultimately just like not being like turning away from one's cognitive dissonance. I can see it. Like I can see the fact that a lot of legislation that makes its way through Congress happens because of lobbyists on K Street doing their job really, really well. And that may not necessarily like align with, what's in the public interest. I can see that like politicians will say things and do things for narrow political ends. I can see that. And cynics can see that too, right? And cynics look at that and they say, well, if the system is this badly rigged, then like what like then like I'm just going to play the game in a way that like maximizes the benefit to me. And I might say things that sound romantic, but at the end of the day, what I care about is that there's less obstacles in my path, that I will accumulate the most wealth. I will be able to use that wealth in ways that is as unencumbered by outside influence as possible, and that all of these benefits shall accrue to me, and that I don't really feel any moral obligation to the future, to my posterity, nor do I care about anything other than advancing those interests. And I think like that is like ultimately like the cleavage between two different groups of people. And I can look at romantics who hail from the left or romantics who hail from the right, who really do like, I mean, like I'm not a conservative, but there are like actual real like conservative thinkers who like I admire as having like a romantic sort of notion. Like, they might buy way more into some like Straussian arguments around like how society should be organized around stability. I might even have some sympathy here and there for like some of those points. But like I can like, somebody like that because when they think about those things, they're thinking about community and they're thinking about the world that they want to leave behind. And I think ultimately what we see, and I think some of the people who we referred to today, I actually think probably are a lot more on the cynical side. And so I want to live in a world and have friends with people who share those romantic notions for the fact that humanity, can advance, that the world can be a happier place, that it can be a place in which more people's like deepest like desires can be realized. I think maybe the reason I was thinking about this at Burning Man in particular, and I actually a lot of people make fun of the event, and I get it, but I actually think it was a pretty like amazing experience to really just see the level of creative energy that an event like that represents. It's like pure creativity, like it's an event which was just like willed into existence through human imagination and this sort of act of intentional community, and to think that like this is actually like the core of like what makes life worth living, right? Is this sort of romantic ideal of like creation and love and companionship that I think the romantics of both the right and the left can often usually agree on, like that's like what we want out of life. And I think I can be friends with all those people.
Yeah, but I feel the same way.
We are in some way at war with the cynics who have looked at the game and they've said, I see all those things too, and those things make me wonder why I should give a shit at all. And that's just not a path that I'm willing to go down, because I do care about our legacy. I do care about how the world will be, beyond the span of my own life. And that to me is like the real category of politics that I tie myself to, that I think leaves a lot of room for friendship and community beyond some belief in whether or not we have single payer healthcare, or how high or low taxes are, or what you think, trade policy with China should be. So like I that to me, that is like ultimately like the most like important part of my politics.
That makes a lot of sense. And I try to get more to those duopolies too of, people will have many different phrases and sayings. So there's cynics and romantics. And for me, I've been pivoting more and more, like even the way I'm thinking about Bitcoin, then I get more excited about just like decentralized tech and other types of things outside of Bitcoin. And you've said this before and so many others. It's like, yes, Bitcoin is one tool. There's also like Bitcoin isn't going to be the answers to all these other decentralized protocols. Like you don't need a Bitcoin layer 4 I mean, there's Bitcoin built into it through Zaps and payment and stuff, which I think is great. But Nostr is not built on a Bitcoin layer. There's no blockchain, or it's its own protocol. There's going to be other protocols that are developed that are, I think, good things for humanity. Mm-hmm. So the one closing thing I wanted to get into was, your thoughts and perspectives on decentralization versus centralization, what you all are doing at TBD, and how you view technology as a role to help humanity through that lens.
Well, it's probably like a really long conversation. I don't know how much time you have, but look, decentralization is, what do we mean? What do we mean by that, right? When we say that, it's a very like loaded term.
Mm-hmm. So it's just like, it's not just like progressive, but it's a whole thing in its own. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I think like, look, I don't think that everything can or should be decentralized, right? Like for example, I think that, for there to be society, we must have some common foundations. We must have some common epistemology. These things are very, very critical to social and societal stability. That I think, and that stability is very important and is a prerequisite to human thriving. Now, when we talk about decentralization with these technologies, what we're really talking about is creating different incentive structures to counteract what we see as negative incentives towards the accrual of political, cultural, and economic control. I think what we mean by that is, in more sort of concrete terms, is I think we worry about the ways in which certain entities, private companies and governments, have accumulated power, not necessarily even because for nefarious reasons. Like, I don't think that like Google and Google search is like basically the default search engine for the world because Google set out to like, basically put all of its like prevent others from building search engines and prevent others from doing those things. They got there because they built the best product, and they didn't kill people and lie, cheat, and steal to do it. But it doesn't mean that the accrual of that level of power is not potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that accrual of power couldn't be subverted. It doesn't, like, even if Google today, like, let's just take for for granted that like Google is like literally has humanity's best interests in mind right now. It doesn't mean that like whoever is the CEO of Google 10 years from now will have humanity's best interests in mind. It doesn't mean that like heavens forbid that the United States were to fall into some sort of like authoritarian spiral, that the power that Google wouldn't be captured and wielded by that power. It doesn't. It also stands to reason that the conglomeration of that much information is also a potential honeypot for a malicious actor. It's also reasonable to worry in the age of artificial intelligence and the power that comes with having that amount of concentrated data could provide somebody and maybe even power that they themselves can't control, right? To start talking about the existential risk problems around AI. So, like, when I talk about decentralization, I worry about those incentive structures. I don't think in terms of these like deep, dark conspiracies about like who has the right to have the power or not. I don't think that's really the interesting question. The real interesting question is, to the extent that these power structures have even under the best intentions have led us to this place, we ought to think about these things in a way that's about making sure that incentives in the future do not ultimately lead us towards these incredibly dark ends. So what we're doing at TBD is we're trying to build a new set of technologies that allows us to start thinking about the fact that there is a surplus of compute, there's a surplus of data storage. We're walking around with like terabytes of data storage in our pocket now, and underutilized idle computing power with increasingly efficient mobile processors, and saying to ourselves, in that world, when you start to think about the equities of these risks that exist, or like these risks of centralization, can we now, with that's those surpluses, can we actually turn those surpluses into incentives to like change the way in which applications and personal identifying information and identity is a really big part of TBD's mission to create a decentralized identity service, really building on these sort of ideas and thinking like, well, and maybe we could even have a more magical internet than we have today. Like that's like way more semantic in nature. Tim Berners-Lee talks about this, right? And I think that that's like ultimately what we're building towards. And I think, I don't want to. I've tried to take a very like positive and hopeful tone like with you today, right? On and like the future. But I think these dangers are real, and I think that this, with the stuff that we're trying to do with Web 5, my hope is that obviously my hope is that it succeeds. But my secondary hope is if it doesn't succeed, that something like it succeeds. In order to ultimately rebuild the incentive structures that have led us to this place. And there aren't really many. It's not obvious to me what the off ramps will be unless positive incentives are created as the corollary. So I think decentralization is needed in places where the incentives accrue towards the unchecked use of power, or the potential for the unchecked use of power, in a particular, in like an asymmetric way. So I'm a little bit less worried, say, about the centralization of like, say, something like Instagram than maybe like other people in the space are, right? I mean, I don't think Instagram is good for people. I think it's, the research has shown it's like actually really, really bad for people's like self-image and their sense of how good their life is vis-a-vis others. And there's always been studies done into it. But like, just like sharing pictures on a centralized platform just to show the world that, your awesome latte, that you just got. I mean, I think that's like relatively harmless, like, in like the grand scope of things. And I think that like, I don't, and I actually think like social media actually like is not as important, to people's lives as they think it is. Like this idea that like Twitter is like the most important town square in the world. Like I mean, it is a town square, but like, I think the reality is that like, I think like only 1 in 5 Americans were like ever really on it. So like, does that mean that like 4 in 5 Americans are just like not part of any important national conversation? That's pretty condescending.
Yeah.
Actually sounds.
I would, the only thing I would push back in terms of the importance before I get too away from it is it's also low hanging fruit, in my opinion, though. So something like Nostr, like we'll have Ben Ark on as well to talk about this, but just, him, Fiat Jeff, Rabble, others who have focused on kind of this social media layer of Nostr. Like Nostr is this protocol that could be so many different things. It's kind of like trying to describe Web 5. And I know you guys just kind of played around with that because Web 3 is just this thing of like, this is just VC mumbo jumbo. But with social media on something that's decentralized, that's low hanging fruit to play around with. What could decentralization look like in terms of the major social media players are centralized? And the only thing I would push back and say, yes, for a lot of American residents, Western residents right now, is your life at danger and your livelihood as much on centralized social media? No, I think Elon is taking Twitter, me personally, and X in a direction that he's been very clear about WeChat and all these other things that I just don't want to be a part of. I don't want to envision a world where that is the de facto standard and we're slipping towards that. Now, there are people in Saudi Arabia that will be arrested and murdered because of what they've posted on Twitter. And now again, decentralization doesn't remove that risk because it's also public right now, at least Nostr, but there could be private channels. There are private relays, there are other private channels that cannot, censorship resistant. All of this other stuff is really important. Like Elon decided to censor in terms of Turkey's election and said, well, this is better to censor a little bit than to have Twitter not exist at all during the cycle. I don't want to overstate problems, but not understate.
It's an incoherent position.
Right. So maybe I'm being too principled on it, but for me, I'm like, that's low hanging fruit. Why not try decentralization there? Do we need the same metaphor of decentralization for healthcare access?
I'm not saying I'm not saying don't try decentralization. I didn't mean to say that social media doesn't matter, but I am saying it doesn't matter as much as people think. I think that there is a bubble of people, myself included.
Or like Twitter as the town square. I see your point.
Myself included, like I have lived inside that bubble. And like when you pass outside that bubble, because and you talk to like people who aren't on Twitter, it's very clear that they do not like feel and see the world in the same way that I do. And I know that like Sam Harris has like talked a lot about this as well, like his experience of leaving it. And it's just true. Like I actually just recently re-quit Twitter for like a second time. Like I was off of it for like 4 or 5 months and I'm off of it again. And I feel
probably feel a little better.
I feel like way more mentally healthy. Like I did see some people's responses to my like last tweet where I kind of like said I was like kind of leaving and it was bad for my mental health. And some of the people were kind of like saying that that's like my own mistake for like caring what other people think. And like, I think that's like actually like a very like I actually think that's a very silly thing to say. Like if you care about the world, right? If you care about the world being a better place, caring about what other people think is a pretty important thing to do. Like if a majority of people in my social circle think something that I think is like morally horrendous, like I probably should care a lot about that. Like,
and you're going to want to add your voice, right? Or your impact or whatever. Yeah.
Yes. And so like for me, like checking out a Twitter is the culmination of two things. It's a culmination of the fact that like I do care about what other people think, at least like, I don't care about it in the sense that I take things personally. I really don't care if what people say about me or the words and the names they attribute to me. I don't care about that. But I certainly I care a lot about the project of liberal democracy in the world. I care a lot about that. Like it's one of the things that I not only do I care about it and I say positive things about it, there is a large part of my private life outside of my professional life that is dedicated to doing things within my capacity, financial and otherwise, for advancing that goal. Not just in the context of the United States, like, but even in the context of like, the global sphere. I am unapologetically a believer. Like someone might describe me as like a liberal internationalist or whatever word they want to put on that. And like for the political science sense. But like, I definitely like believe that it is not only like legitimate for us to say, defend liberal democracy around the world, up to and including, yes, like providing military and defensive aid to Ukraine and to Taiwan, in my opinion. Be very careful about that. And to the extent that like people don't agree with that, and people will say, well, why should we help any of these other countries when we can't even help ourselves? Or how dare we send $1 billion to Ukraine when there's like a bridge in like Idaho that like hasn't been fixed by the federal government, or any of these like ridiculous zero sum statements.
It's a lot more than $1 billion, I will
Yeah.
say. But I agree with you for the most part. But it's been a lot. Yeah.
But I care. Of course, I care about that. Like, why would
and it's not exactly how that works either, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I don't want to like debate like the silliness of zero sum thinking, but like I definitely think like, yeah, like if you want the world to be at a better place, you have to care about what other people think.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think other people are thinking things that are like contrary to what you see as a positive path for the future of humanity, then like, yeah, like for someone like myself that like thinks a lot about those things, yeah, like being on Twitter and seeing like the echo chamber of like, you know, that is the sort of like Bitcoin Twitter, and like increasingly sort of a resurgence of the alt-right on there. Yeah, it's not good for my mental health. Like I'm happy to keep like arguing against those things, but I don't have to like expose myself to the sort of like incredibly like bad social incentives that like Twitter creates for amplifying outrage and for like trying to like poke bears and like and now like honestly like Twitter like paying people now for the amount of impressions their tweets get like tells me that it's going to get a lot worse. And so yeah, like I don't want to be a part of that. And so and like I said, it's not that people disagree with me. I don't care. Like I would rather people disagree with me than agree with me, because I find that intellectually stimulating. But that's not what people are doing. People are literally just trying to piss people off, and they think it's funny. And that's like, and that's only going to get worse. That's only going to get worse with these economic incentives that X.com is putting in place. So anyways, that's my kind of full-throated explanation as to why I've stepped away from that platform.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way I live on a lot of things too. And I think if people don't know what to do in terms of, because a lot of people just throw their hands up, whether it's privacy, whether it's Twitter, whether it's whatever, they're just like, this is the way it is. This is what we have. This is what we can use. This is the political structure we have, or whatever. You know, it does sound cliche, but one immediate thing you can do is start thinking about what decisions you would make for yourself, right? Like for me, I'm like, I would not like to support Elon in this quest. And I hate saying support Elon in this quest, but he's made it very much his personal project. So it feels very much like Elon's platform, right? I would not like to support that personally. I'd like to support a different avenue. It's very different conversation, but I'm also very overtly a vegan in the space as well, just showing people there's diversity of that as well. That was a very individual decision for me. I'm not trying to argue with people about that.
Are you trying to argue that you can like you can be a Bitcoiner and not only eat beef? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think, I'm still unsure about that, but right. So it's like things like that. It's like, okay, you can start by saying, I don't want to engage with Twitter because that's kind of just a messed up way and all these incentives. Like I choose a personal diet, I choose a personal religion, a personal this, a personal that. Like start there. And then let's see what we can do collectively as a community. So I agree with that.
I mean, I personally, just to be clear, I actually love beef, but I don't think I've ever tweeted that. I don't think
You'll get a lot of impressions, Mike. You should.
In beef, like identity, like group that's like kind of connected now in some people's mind is like actually like the weirdest thing ever.
Yeah.
I don't quite get it, but sure.
I always joke, I'm like, if I have to see pictures of your steak, you can see pictures of my like vegan bowl that I made. So I like sometimes will post it just as like a funny thing in my head of like, I'm going to have this because I'm seeing so many like steak pictures. I'm like, I'm going to throw like this vegan picture into the mix just so it's out there.
Not allowed.
Right. Yeah.
You'll be excommunicated from Bitcoin.
Seriously. All right. On that note, I'm just kidding. So let's wrap up here. I think I definitely want to have a more thorough conversation with you on many other things still. I love some of your nuanced thoughts around, gosh, like our role as global citizens. I think there's a lot we could get into with that. But I think a lot of people enjoy this conversation. Hopefully, I didn't get you in too much trouble, but I think it was good.
Oh, this is great. That was great. In fact, like I think this is like a good time now to be having this kind of conversation around Bitcoin's culture internally and its place within like more broader culture and its
Mhm.
relationship to politics. Because like, I have, even though I kind of stepped away from X.com, it didn't go unnoticed actually that there's a huge sort of conversation now happening within that Bitcoin community there about what we're talking
Mhm.
about like the fact that you know that a lot of Bitcoin culture is very exclusionary, and you're seeing it. Like I'm actually happy to see some like pretty prominent Bitcoiners have been sort of like pointing out that like Bitcoin is not culturally approachable.
Mhm.
As you know, I've been saying that for like years now.
Yeah.
But it does seem that there's like more and more Bitcoiners who are kind of coming to the same conclusion that like
Mhm.
if we're actually going to grow this, like we need to like talk a little bit more openly about like kind of how crazy some aspects of our culture is. And
Mhm.
so even though you and I'm saying this now, I'm actually saying it at a time that a lot of other Bitcoiners are saying it too, and
Yeah.
that's actually like very encouraging. So I'm actually a little bit less out on a ledge right now than maybe I was like a year or two ago.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's certainly encouraging.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And I think we'll continue to get there. And my hope is that we have these conversations and then just keep going. Like I have this conversation, but also some episodes I'm gonna have more technical conversations about really cool Bitcoin products or other like there's gonna be so many different types of conversations. Some people will be like, I don't want to listen to them talk about this. That's fine. We've got another episode, or you can listen to this or that. Like there's so much diversity of thought and things. So the more we can have these conversations and get it out in the open, the more we can bring people in and the more people we have just building on Bitcoin, creating content, having all these conversations about our broken world, the better. And then we can just keep moving forward. We don't have to talk about it as much. We don't have to say, why are you saying that? Like, let's just move forward. And so, yeah, I agree. I think more people are coming to that realization. And again, for people to understand, it's not about, I disagree with you. Don't say that. It's about like, what is the goal? What is the goal and what is the point of conversations? It's just being aware of that rather than so dismissive. I 100% agree. But thank you, Mike, for jumping on. I had a lot of fun doing this.
Yeah, this is
Do
fun.
you have any?
I
Do you
didn't
have
know
any?
I didn't know we were going to go this way, but like it's fun to like talk about it at this level and like in a first principles way. It's probably not what many people expected, but yeah, I happy to come back on anytime. This was just super cool. I'm glad. I know that we did this once before and it didn't quite work out
Mm,
for us.
that's yeah. Well, that's when. So previously, too, Mark was the previous host of the podcast, and Mark is
Yeah,
still around and things like that. So yeah, and again, what's been fun about this podcast, the last thing I'll say is there's a lot of very, very vocal progressives that did take a bit of a step back the past year because I think people were just getting kind of exhausted of the dialogue, of the rhetoric. So bringing this podcast back on, kind of revamping it, having just literally like many different types of conversations on the show and different types of guests. I think it's getting people a bit more excited, even for people that are like, you know, I hope people listening, it's not just about I'm going to listen because I agree. And there have been people that have listened and said it's too progressive or it's not progressive enough or all of this stuff is really funny to me because the point is just having just a range of conversation that to me personally I don't think exists enough, so I wanted to put it out there, not just to have something else
yeah,
in the echo chamber. And again, hopefully the goal is we grow more and more of a presence so that more people that are not into Bitcoin start getting some peripheral messages and seeing some things. And I think there's been a lot of positive feedback in the community, let's put it that way, about what we're trying to do here and the conversations, even with people that would vehemently disagree with me on things, because they're seeing the bigger impact of these types of conversations for trying to widen the tent, which is like it's an honor. It's really fun too. I'm doing it because I like how I wanted to talk to you because I'm like Mike seems like a cool guy. I want to have a conversation with him. That was the approach here. So yeah, this is super fun. Do you want to send anyone to any place in terms of you said you took a break from X. Again, would love to see you on Nostr.
I haven't.
We've got a few more diverse voices there, but I get it as well. Social media is
So
exhausting.
I started a Medium blog, and I have one post on it,
Oh, awesome. Okay.
and I don't actually have like the URL off the top of my head, but
if you want to send it to me, you can. If not,
and that was like one of the ways I was thinking of like maybe like more long form, like expressing like some of my thoughts, like as opposed to like in like fragments on Twitter threads /x.com threads. I haven't really.
I think it's healthier. Not saying for you personally, but for me, I've started to do that more. There's a Nostr enabled client called habla.news that allows that same thing. I think it's better personally, rather than
I think it's just also
Twitter threads.
The only reason I haven't really thought about like doing it like through something like that is like a social network is like I'm not sure that I want the incentives of like worrying about like what people say back to me, right? I mean, not that I don't love it. Like I honestly like I love debate, like, and I like would be happy to jump on like debates right, left, and center. But like I think there's something very pure to just sort of being able to say like, look, like I've thought very deeply about something and I want to like just like lay it out there, and it's like completely unvarnished way, as opposed to really worrying about like how people are going to like comment on it. Like I don't even want like comments turned on my Medium.
No, that makes sense. It's a different thing.
It's just like, I mean, maybe like I don't know that I'm not even saying that I like won't go back to like social media like Nostr or Blue Sky or whatever. I'm not intrinsically opposed to like doing that. I've like played around with all of them, but I think like I'm just like trying to like I'm sort of like selfishly like trying to like find my own zen right now.
That's a good thing, man. So, that's good. Yeah. Awesome. Anywhere, I mean, we'll make sure that like, TBDs in the show notes, things like that, but anything else before we sign off here?
No, this is great. Yeah. Like I said, welcome. Happy to come back anytime. Thank you for having me today. This was great.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. We'll talk to you later.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, bye.